July 25, 1944. 0937 hours just west of St. Lo, Normandy. A damp morning haze still hung over the hedgerows as General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commander of a panzer division, raised his field glasses. Something felt wrong. The constant rumble of American artillery, which had pounded German lines without pause since D-Day, had suddenly gone silent. To Bayerlein, the quiet carried more threat than relief. His men, many veterans of Rommel's Africa Corps, held their ground along the St. Lo-Perrier Road. They had stood firm under Soviet barrages on the Eastern Front, bombardments so heavy they shook the ground like an earthquake. They had faced the relentless fire of British artillery at El Alamein. Yet nothing in their past prepared them for what was about to unfold at 0938. At that moment, more than 1,000 American artillery pieces fired together. Not in the usual waves, not in the traditional rolling barrages that had dominated military doctrine for decades, but all at once. Shells launched from guns scattered across miles of terrain, some as close as 6 miles, others over 15, were timed so that every round struck simultaneously. Light 105 mm howitzers, medium 155 mm guns, heavy 8-inch howitzers, and massive 240 mm weapons all contributed to one devastating, unified explosion. The timing required for this feat demanded calculations far beyond anything previous wars had seen. Each unit not only plotted range and angle, but also accounted for the shell's time of flight. A 105 mm shell fired on a high trajectory could take 23 seconds to land. A 155 mm long tom, positioned farther back, might take 31 seconds. Firing orders were carefully staggered so every shell from every battery arrived in the same instant. For the German defenders, this was not just an artillery strike. It was a showcase of American industrial power, mathematical precision, and organizational control applied to the battlefield. It shattered not only the physical defenses of the Wehrmacht, but also their assumptions about how modern wars could be fought. To see how revolutionary time on target was, one has to understand what artillery doctrine looked like in 1944. For centuries, artillery had followed set patterns. Napoleon had massed his guns into grand batteries that unleashed fire in waves. In World War I, rolling barrages crept ahead of advancing infantry at fixed intervals. The Germans themselves had perfected their doctrine of concentrated fire, Schwerpunkt, using overwhelming force at critical points. Their artillery, refined through victories in Poland, France, and the early campaigns in Russia, emphasized rapid concentration and quick redeployment. German forward observers worked closely with their batteries to direct fire with speed and accuracy. At the start of the war, German artillery was indeed superior. In North Africa, American gunners struggled to match this coordination. At Kasserine Pass, U.S. batteries were scattered and unable to bring firepower together effectively. German officers concluded that American artillery was clumsy and inflexible. What they failed to notice was that the Americans were learning, and learning fast. They were applying the same principles of industrial organization and management that drove their factories to the art of war. The creation of time on target was the outcome of this new approach. Instead of treating artillery as scattered units supporting local commanders, U.S. planners built a networked system capable of delivering overwhelming power at exact moments. 4 key elements made this possible. First was the forward observer system. Unlike German vorgeschobene Beobachter, who usually worked with a single battery, American forward observers could call in fire from entire battalion or corps-level artillery groups. Each observer carried an SCR-619 radio, later upgraded to the SCR-610, which gave them reliable communication with fire direction centers far behind the lines. The SCR-619, described in Technical Manual 11619 in April 1945, operated on FM frequencies between 27 and 38 MHz. The SCR-610, standardized on September 29, 1941, delivered 20 to 32 watts of power with a dependable range of 5 miles. Second was the Fire Direction Center, or FDC. Pioneered at Fort Sill in the 1930s and perfected in battle, the FDC acted as the brain of the artillery system. Staffed with trained specialists, it used firing tables, slide rules, and graphical firing boards to compute solutions for multiple batteries at once. Third was the communication network. American forces laid down telephone lines at a furious pace. An infantry division could put down as much as 3,000 miles of wire in just 1 month of combat. These dense, redundant networks ensured that orders and fire missions moved instantly across dozens of batteries. The fourth and often overlooked element was standardization. Every American shell, whether a 105mm or a 155mm, was manufactured with exacting consistency in factories from Pennsylvania to California. This precision meant that calculations made in the FDC would match the real-world performance of the guns, no matter which unit fired them. Together, these four innovations transformed U.S. artillery into something the Germans had never imagined. A perfectly coordinated system capable of delivering destruction with split-second timing. On that morning outside St. Lo, the German defenders learned firsthand what it meant when technology, organization, and industrial might fused into a single weapon. By 1944, German ammunition was increasingly being produced in scattered factories using slave labor, which affected both quality and consistency. The German army had its first encounters with limited time-on-target tactics in Italy during early 1944. At first, they dismissed these incidents as chance rather than deliberate strategy. That changed during the breakout from Anzio on May 23, 1944. There, 16 battalions of American artillery, over 200 guns, delivered a massive, coordinated strike against German positions along the Caesar Line. This method had been built through months of trial and practice. The 9th Infantry Division had experimented with early versions in Sicily, and the 1st Infantry Division refined it in Italy. By the time of D-Day, time on target had become standard doctrine, though German intelligence wrongly judged reports about it as exaggerations. On July 25, 1944, the curtain was pulled back completely. Operation Cobra began, and with it the full demonstration of American time-on-target firepower. General Omar Bradley had assembled the largest concentration of U.S. artillery in Europe. More than 1,000 guns were readied, from 105mm howitzers to 8-inch heavy guns. Within this force, the 7th and 8th Corps alone contributed 522 guns, backed by 4 2-inch mortars and tank destroyers pressed into artillery rolls. The target zone was a rectangle roughly 7,000 yards wide and 2,500 yards deep, just south of the Saint-Lô-Perrier Road. Inside it were the main units of the Panzer Lehr Division and elements of the 5th Parachute Division. Around 5,000 German troops dug into strong defensive positions. At 09:38, immediately after a wave of heavy bomber strikes that had already shocked the defenders, every American gun opened fire. Shells fired from ranges between 5,000 and 25,000 yards hit their targets almost simultaneously, in a carefully calculated wave of destruction. For Operation Cobra alone, the U.S. Army allocated 170,000 shells, 140,000 to 7th Corps and 27,000 to the 8th Corps. It was one of the heaviest artillery concentrations of the war. The barrage unfolded in precisely timed stages, with successive time-on-target strikes crawling across German positions. After that, silence fell. Then American infantry moved forward. By the end, Panzer Lehr, which had entered Normandy with 14,000 men and 190 tanks, was no longer an effective fighting force. General Fritz Bayerlein sent a report to Field Marshal von Kluge, describing his shattered division. "My front lines look like the surface of the moon, and at least 70% of my troops are out of action, dead, wounded, shell-shocked, or dazed." What many German officers could not grasp was the science behind this precision. This wasn't just a matter of firing many guns at once. It required solving complex ballistic equations on the spot, to make shells from different types of guns arrive at the same instant. The Americans had to know the exact location of each gun battery, the precise distance to the target, the muzzle velocity of each gun type, the weight and shape of each shell, wind speed and direction at different altitudes, air temperature and density. The effect of the Earth's rotation on long-range fire, powder temperature, which influenced muzzle velocity. To handle this complexity, U.S. forces used advanced tools such as the Graphical Firing Table, GFT, and the Graphical Sight Table, GST. These tools allowed calculations that were far faster and more accurate than the conventional firing tables still relied upon by German batteries. The success of time on target also depended on a communications network far beyond anything the Germans had built. By July 1944, A single American infantry division in Normandy was operating more radios than a full German corps had possessed in 1940. By August 1944, the 1st Infantry Division alone was running over 900 radio sets. Each artillery unit had multiple backup systems: wire, radio, and messenger lines. Fire direction centers were in direct contact with every battery, every forward observer, and higher headquarters. This allowed the Americans to mass artillery fire instantly without concentrating the guns themselves. Batteries spread out over a 20-mile front could deliver firepower as if they were side by side, their shells converging on a single point in time. Gradually, German officers began to realize that time on target was more than a battlefield tactic. It reflected the industrial and organizational strengths of the United States applied to warfare. Standardization was key. Every 105mm howitzer, whether produced at Rock Island Arsenal or Watervliet Arsenal, had the same ballistic performance. Every shell, whether made in Pennsylvania or Missouri, met identical specifications. That consistency, made possible by U.S. mass production, was what allowed American gunners to calculate so precisely. In contrast, German weapons production was fragmented by Allied bombing and increasingly dependent on scattered factories using forced labor. Quality suffered, and shells and guns often lacked uniformity. This made it impossible for Germany to replicate the kind of precision that powered American artillery. The difference extended to training as well. At Fort Sill, the U.S. Army's artillery training center, thousands of skilled fire direction center personnel were produced during the war, ensuring that every division had experts capable of executing these complex missions. The German counteroffensive at Mortain, launched on August 7, 1944, provided another devastating example. Hitler ordered a large-scale counterattack to cut off the American advance, deploying the rebuilt 2nd SS Panzer Division, the 1st SS Panzer Division, and the 116th Panzer Division. As German armor prepared to strike, American observers on Hill 317 had already mapped the ground. When the assault began at midnight, they immediately called in pre-planned time-on-target missions. The 2nd Infantry Division alone fired as many as 20 of these strikes in a single night, breaking up the German advance before it could gain momentum. Through Operation Cobra and Mortain, the message became undeniable. American artillery, using time on target, had combined firepower, mathematics, communication, and industrial strength into a weapon unlike anything the German army had faced before. Official after-action reports from Hill 192 describe how the American 30th Infantry Division, though outnumbered, repeatedly called in fire missions from 7 separate artillery battalions through the night. Each strike delivered instant destruction on German assembly points, supply routes, and command centers. Survivors from the German side later described it as hitting walls of hot steel that made further advance impossible. By daylight, the attack had completely stalled. Field Marshal von Kluge informed Hitler that the offensive could not continue in the face of such overwhelming American artillery. The ability to conduct time-on-target missions so routinely showed just how advanced American training had become. In less than 3 years, the U.S. Army transformed millions of civilians into skilled specialists in one of the most technical areas of warfare. At Fort Sill, the Field Artillery School compressed what had once been decades of military science into a 17-week course. Students studied ballistics, weather effects, surveying, and communications. More importantly, they were trained to think of artillery not as individual guns but as a fully integrated system. The program was hands-on. Trainees carried out thousands of simulated fire missions, solving time-on-target problems until it became second nature. By graduation, a trained fire direction center team could calculate a 10-battery time-on-target strike in less than 180 seconds. German officers later admitted they were stunned by how many highly skilled technicians the Americans could produce in such a short time. In 3 years, the U.S. had trained more fire direction specialists than Germany had produced in decades. It was military education scaled like factory production, standardized, efficient, and highly effective. Time on target also depended on massive amounts of ammunition. A single mission could use more rounds than a German division might receive in an entire month. During Operation Cobra, U.S. artillery fired more than 170,000 shells set aside just for that operation. Behind this firepower stood a logistics machine that delivered thousands of tons of ammunition to the front every day. Endless truck convoys ran from the Normandy beaches to the batteries, creating a non-stop chain of supply. The quality of American ammunition was another major factor. Every shell was built to exact standards, with consistent propellant and precise weight balance. This allowed fire direction centers to calculate time of flight with confidence, knowing the shell would perform exactly as expected. German ammunition, by contrast, suffered from falling quality as production was dispersed and factories relied on forced labor. German artillery officers often had to test fire new batches to determine real muzzle velocity, while Americans could trust their ammunition straight from the crate. German officers were especially impressed by how well U.S. artillery accounted for weather. Accurate time on target required exact data on wind speeds at different altitudes, air pressure, temperature, and humidity. The Americans had built a full meteorological service to support this. Every corps had weather units recording conditions every 30 minutes. Weather balloons fitted with radio transmitters, called radiosondes, gathered data up to 30,000 feet. These readings were immediately sent to all fire direction centers, allowing American artillery to stay precise, even when weather changed suddenly. This advantage showed during the November 1944 offensive in the Hürtgen Forest. Despite fog, rain, and shifting winds that disrupted German fire, American time on target missions remained accurate. The forest, once thought resistant to artillery, became a killing ground. The U.S. developed tree burst missions, setting shells to explode in the canopy. In November 1944, the 4th Infantry Division, advancing through the forest, called in strikes combining high explosive and white phosphorus rounds. The blast sent wooden splinters down like spears, mixed with burning phosphorus that set the forest floor alight. Survivors described the effect as immediate destruction. The 28th Infantry Division, fighting toward Schmidt, also used time on target to smash German strongpoints. On November 6th, a single mission brought 12 battalions to fire into a 500-meter square area. More than 3,000 shells hit in just 30 seconds. Positions that had resisted for weeks were wiped out in half a minute. Because the thick woods muffled sound, the shells landed with almost no warning, intensifying the shock. German medical reports from this battle noted extremely high rates of what they called artillery-induced trauma, troops who had endured normal bombardments but were broken mentally by the concentrated devastation of time on target. The encirclement at the Falaise pocket in August 1944 gave perhaps the clearest proof of its power. As German forces tried to escape through the shrinking gap, American artillery kept up near continuous time on target missions on the retreat routes. On August 17th alone, U.S. gunners carried out documented strikes on the Falaise-Argenton road every 30 minutes throughout the day. Each one involved 10 to 15 batteries firing together, tearing apart German columns struggling to flee. Through battles from Hill 192 to Falaise, time on target became more than just a tactic. It was proof that U.S. artillery, backed by training, industry, and logistics, had reached a level of effectiveness no other army could match. General Hans Eberbach, commander of the shattered Panzer Group West, reported that American artillery fire was so overwhelming that it was impossible to move reserves forward or even evacuate the wounded. Any vehicle movement became a death sentence. The main road through Falaise was soon called the Corridor of Death. Wrecked vehicles, dead horses, and abandoned weapons clogged the path, slowing down the retreat and making each following unit even more vulnerable to time-on-target strikes. By August 21st, when the pocket was finally sealed, 50,000 German soldiers had been captured and 10,000 were killed. Most of these casualties came directly from artillery fire. As German troops withdrew toward the Seine in late August, they discovered that even river crossings offered no relief from time-on-target barrages. American forward observers had already infiltrated deep into the countryside, setting up hidden positions with clear views of every possible crossing site. At Vernon, Rouen, and Mortain, German attempts to put up pontoon bridges were instantly met with perfectly timed artillery fire. The precision was so exact that many bridges were blown apart while still under construction, with engineer units caught in the explosions as they worked. The destruction of these crossings showed how flexible time-on-target tactics could be. Soon, German units refused to cross rivers in daylight, causing huge traffic jams along the western banks, traffic that became easy targets for additional American strikes. By December 1944, American artillery had been upgraded with a breakthrough technology that made time on target even deadlier. The VT, or variable time fuse, better known as the proximity fuse, was first introduced during the Battle of the Bulge. These fuses detonated shells in mid-air, just above ground level, where the spread of fragments was maximized. Once VT-fused shells were used in coordinated time-on-target missions, the killing power multiplied. Soldiers hidden in foxholes or trenches could no longer rely on cover. Over 22 million of these fuses were produced during the war, completely changing the face of artillery in its final stages. At first, German intelligence believed the Americans had invented some new kind of secret weapon. Reports spoke of airborne mines or timed cluster bombs. The truth, that it was a combination of precise timing with proximity fuses, seemed too simple to explain the destruction. When American forces pushed toward the Siegfried Line in September 1944, German commanders trusted their concrete bunkers and armored cupolas to withstand conventional bombardments. But American artillery developed specialized time-on-target missions designed for fortifications. By mixing instant-impact high-explosive rounds with delayed fuse armor-piercing shells, they were able to cause surface blasts and deep penetration strikes at the same moment. At Geilenkirchen in November, the 84th Infantry Division faced heavy Siegfried Line defenses. They called in a time-on-target mission involving 12 battalions, 144 guns, firing a variety of ammunition types in perfect coordination. During the German Ardennes offensive in December 1944, time-on-target also proved its value on defense. Even though American units were surprised at first, their artillery quickly regrouped and began launching precise strikes on German spearheads. On December 19th, as the 2nd Panzer Division advanced toward Dinant, forward observers from the 3rd Armored Division requested emergency fire support. In less than 4 minutes, 8 American battalions had firing solutions ready. The resulting barrage destroyed the lead German battalion in only 60 seconds. This rapid concentration of firepower was critical in halting the German advance. At Bastogne, surrounded American units relied heavily on time-on-target fire missions, called in dangerously close to their own positions. These barrages tore apart German assault groups attempting to breach the defensive ring, buying precious time for the defenders to hold. As the Allies reached the Rhine in March 1945, time on target was unleashed at a scale never before seen. The crossing operations were supported by artillery concentrations of staggering size. At the Wesel crossing on March 24, 1945, the Allies assembled 4,000 guns with 270 of them American. The opening bombardment lasted 4 hours, and every 15 minutes, new time-on-target barrages thundered down. Each wave brought hundreds of guns striking in unison across entire kilometers of front. In March alone, American artillery fired over 65,000 tons of ammunition in preparation for the crossing. German survivors described the bombardment as beyond anything they had experienced. Some soldiers were killed by concussion alone, their bodies showing no wounds. At Oppenheim on March 22nd, Patton's Third Army crossed under the protection of a massive time-on-target barrage. This mission involved 33 battalions, more than 400 guns delivering 10,000 shells in only 60 seconds. German officers later admitted that whole battalions had simply vanished, leaving no survivors to report the destruction. German military leaders eventually came to realize that time on target was the direct application of American industrial methods to warfare. The same mass production system that allowed Detroit to roll out a bomber every hour allowed American artillery to synchronize hundreds of guns at once. This industrial approach extended to every part of the system, factories producing over 8 million shells every month by late 1944, transport networks moving them continuously to the front, and communication systems that coordinated strikes with business-like efficiency. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical damage. German medical records described unprecedented levels of combat trauma caused by coordinated bombardments. Soldiers who had endured days of Soviet barrages on the Eastern Front were broken after just minutes under American time-on-target fire. The trauma was so severe that some German veterans could no longer function, even when they survived the blasts. The sudden, synchronized nature of American time-on-target fire stripped German soldiers of every coping mechanism they had developed on the battlefield. There was no gradual build-up, no rhythm to anticipate, and no chance to mentally prepare. Field hospitals across the front recorded strange new symptoms among those exposed to repeated barrages. sudden paralysis triggered by unexpected sounds, inability to handle multiple sensory inputs at once, and an intense fear of synchronized events themselves. Unlike traditional cases of shell shock, which sometimes eased with rest, these conditions often lingered even after soldiers were evacuated far from the front. One of the most striking descriptions came from Fritz Bayerlein, who admitted, "My front lines look like the surface of the moon, and at least 70% of my troops are either dead, wounded, broken, or unable to fight. All my tanks are gone and the roads are virtually unusable." General Hans Eberbach confirmed the scale of destruction, testifying that the American artillery curtain was so thick it was impossible to bring forward reinforcements or even move the wounded. He concluded, "The Americans have built an artillery concentration system that goes beyond anything we ever thought possible." Captured Wehrmacht documents revealed just how desperate German headquarters had become. A weapons testing office noted bluntly, "American coordinated fire demonstrates technological superiority in both computing methods and communications. With current resources, no effective countermeasure exists. The Germans tried to copy the method, but systemic weaknesses made it impossible. They understood the math and could calculate time of flight, but they lacked the essentials: standardized ammunition, dependable radios, trained fire direction personnel, and the industrial base that gave the Americans their edge. At best, German attempts involved 3 or 4 batteries firing together, producing only rough simultaneity. Their largest effort during Operation Nordwind in January 1945 coordinated 8 batteries, yet the shells landed over a 12-second spread, far from American precision. By early 1945, as U.S. forces pushed deeper into Germany, time on target had become routine. At Cologne, the garrison commander surrendered immediately after a single 60-second barrage on March 5th, admitting that further resistance was pointless. The same pattern repeated across the collapsing Reich. Commanders who had fought with stubborn resolve for years gave up after just 1 or 2 American bombardments. In many cases, even the threat of a coordinated strike was enough to force capitulation. The psychological effect of this tactic did not go unnoticed by America's allies and observers. Soviet officers carefully studied the method, while the British openly praised it. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery later wrote, "American time on target showed that modern war is no longer about bravery alone, but about industrial and organizational superiority. Courage and discipline mean little against overwhelming firepower applied with perfect coordination." The impact shaped post-war armies across the world. When the Bundeswehr was founded in 1955, it placed coordinated fire capability at the center of its artillery doctrine, citing the wartime shock of American barrages. The French military restructured its artillery training along similar lines, based on German reports of the experience. The Israeli Defense Forces, formed in 1948, incorporated time-on-target principles from the very start, with guidance from Jewish American veterans who had served in U.S. artillery units. NATO itself adopted the technique as standard doctrine, considering synchronized fire essential against numerically superior Warsaw Pact forces. General Johannes Steinhoff, a Luftwaffe fighter ace who later became chairman of NATO's military committee, summed it up in 1968. "The lesson of American time on target is clear. Superiority in coordination and synchronization can defeat superiority in numbers." The innovations that made time on target possible also laid the foundation for modern fire control systems. The rapid calculation methods and graphical firing tables pioneered by American units anticipated computerized artillery control after the war. For German soldiers in 1944-45, these barrages marked a turning point in warfare. They were not overwhelmed by better fighters, but by better systems. The devastating thunder that struck without warning was more than just firepower. It signaled the arrival of a new way of fighting, where industrial organization and mathematical precision mattered more than individual courage. The Wehrmacht, trained in the traditions of discipline, tactics, and valor, found itself crushed by a system that converted war into an industrial science. American time-on-target fire shattered the old military framework. It showed that victory would belong to those who could transform operations into organized processes, backed by factories, logistics, and communications networks. The echoes of that thunder still shape military doctrine worldwide. Every modern artillery system, every integrated fire mission, every synchronized strike owes something to the revolution of American time on target. The German soldiers who endured it witnessed the beginning of a new age, one where industrial mathematics defeated martial tradition, and where systems, not soldiers, decided the outcome.